Hi, world, or a very particular selection of the world right now. This is Kara St. Louis, and I have finally found a way, thanks to the help of my filmmaker son, to at least record audio of this lecture. This last week has been Old Testament stuff, and on top of that, it's been a sort of waterboarding drip, drip, drip. This is probably the hardest I've ever been hit prior to putting out some information. I'm going to read this to you. He's going to upload it for me later so that you can at least listen to it. There's nothing to look at because I can't get the presentation up right now, but I will. So Emily, go for a run, and everybody else, put your headphones on and kick back and listen to what this is all about. It may be a little bit choppy because I do have to open a different computer because there are slides that I need to read from. You will not be able to see them this time, but they are here. Take that out, put it in here. And this is thanks to Duncan. But everybody tried. Everybody tried. Okay. So off we go. Welcome. Welcome. Finally. All of this year's winter lecture. This suddenly annual event, which I'm more than happy to build every year. And it is building. I'm Kara St. Louis, and the topic this year is vast. From our beginnings on this planet to what we can only call the food program of the mid-20th century onward, programming on television and in our visual media, as well as programmable matter that we ingest in crystalline form, such as sugar. If you're receiving the lecture in this way, as a recording, it will mean that the ramped-up assault on my ability to deliver this lecture right here, right now, has led me to the decision to record it as a fail-safe and send it out this way. And it took everything in our power to get this to fly. Had it not been for the fact that The Sun Thief was on a thumb drive the night my house burned down in 2012, that book would not be out in the world. So we learned to take precautions. I remember having the thumb drive for The Sun Thief on my person at all times, and so it has been with the material this week, on my person at all times. But why are we here today? There are still a few big secrets to be unlocked. For one thing, the stars of the galaxy live on our planet. Let me say that again. The stars of the galaxy live on our planet. Hang on, gang. We can access them merely by walking out across the earth. We can have visionary encounters with the actual celestial beings whose bodies are the stars. For several years now, I've been writing about mystical encounters across our planet, mine and those of others, now or in the past. These original beings and those who acted as their hands and feet here on the virgin earth can still be met. The thing is, the earth is not what you've been trained to think it is. There are a few direct human connections to the solar system, the galaxy, the universe. One is the sun. The sun acts like a universal library in that it is connected to every other sun out there, it seems. Through the sun on our skin, the light in our eyes, the biophotonic energy we transform every day, we receive this information, assuming nothing gets between us and the sun. It is our sustenance and so deserves very great attention. Another are the innumerable power centers laid here on the virgin earth at the very beginning. Some researchers in this area speak of visionary geography. I like the term holy geography, or even better, the holy landscape. To me, this signifies a place which calls the soul, that compels us to make passage and wonder at its energy. The whole of the earth is this, of course. Some places have more concentrated power than others. These tend to be mountains, sometimes bodies of water, but not always. The umbilicus of this world are the gentle hills of Avebury in Wiltshire in England, not a rugged mountain or a rolling sea at all. While I'm talking to you, I have to open up these files. Forgive me. Right. Okay. How did these centers, which cover the planet as varying sized domes, which at one time we could see quite plainly, come to be here? When and what function do they perform? How did they get here? I feel very fortunate that this is the answer I was given to a question I'd been sitting with for some time. I knew that the Fae manifested the ley lines at the behest of Source, but what I did not know was why or how. Where did they come from, these ley lines? Why were they needed? Then a friend sent me some research that was clearly meant to answer that question. There was also, though, what came before that. That's where we'll try to start. There was Source, there were the Fae, and I'll try to bring a snapshot of these beings with whom I've been living now for so long. There was the fashioning of this realm, this planet, to become a cohesive location of plasma energy. Then that energy had to be made accessible to us. I know a few people who've tried to describe or create analogies for this very real pool we swim in. The late Dan Schreiber described the sun, our sun, for example, as a library connected to every other sun library, and that what we received from the sun on our skin or entering our eyes was information from every sun in existence, really. That's a very useful way to break into understanding the kind of relationship I want to describe between the most ancient of beings, the Fae, those I call our seed race, and us today, 21st century human beings. As I said this past year, it became obvious to me that the Fae had manifested the ley lines. Like everything else in our current state of affairs, which is deeply induced amnesia, everything is a matter of reverse engineering. My thoughts were always with the next logical question, which was how and why. Were the ley lines a matter of rounding up the energy that was already here, wild and on the loose? I'm sure that the ley lines converged to focal points, and it's from the focal point that the frequency towers can be raised. Pythagorean towers are hyperbolic towers, and it's from those that things are made manifest in this plane by virtue of tone emitted by our own throats. The mystery and wonder of human identity is the goal. There is much more to the earth than we ordinarily see, and it is increasingly important that we see it. This I discussed in the book Guardians of Blood and Fire, if you want a more in-depth look at the Fae. Nevertheless, what came before the harnessing of energy that resulted in a pattern of ley lines covering our planet? That's my question. Now, as you know, this lecture helps me announce the upcoming book as well. It's called The Great Food Con, aka Taste Buds, which is a long title. I think we could refer to it as Taste Buds from here on. As you can see, it'll be available via Amazon soon. I'll announce when it's available for purchase on my 2 Facebook pages, on my Patreon, and in a little video on YouTube. So if you want it, the notice should be easy to get. And as always, the sources for my research will be well and truly documented in the book, so that you can pursue your own research further. I always encourage you to follow whichever path is illuminated for you as you meet the information. You know, it's interesting. Nikola Tesla had something to say about everything, and it's all been buried. But I have something I want to read to you. Yeah. Nikola Tesla was the hunter who caught the light in his net from the depths of the earth, and the warrior who captured fire from heaven. The beauty and scent of roses, he said, can be used as medicine, and the sun's rays as food. One issue is food. What stellar and terrestrial energy to feed the hungry on earth? With what wine to water all the thirsty so they can get cheer in their hearts and understand that they're gods? The maintenance and assembly, man's body is a perfect machine. Food, what nearly all people eat, to me is harmful and dangerous. Sometimes I imagine that the chefs in the world are in a conspiracy against me. The bloodstream can be controlled, and many processes in and around us. This is Nikola Tesla who said that. And these are my words. We are birthed to be perfect, whole, unbroken, able to manifest as we were meant to do, with the whole of our resonance chamber. Our business was to use the manifesting energy of the domes and the ley lines to energize the planet, to maintain the lively and active surface of our mother. We were and are in many ways still the most important planet in the solar system, at least. For the coin of the star system is not time, it is energy, and we are the masters of such. The human imagination is the translator between the morphogenic field, which is pure potential, and the material living plane, the being for whom we are responsible. I want to talk a little bit about the Virgin Heart. Or, if you rearrange those letters, it's the Earth, isn't it? We'll talk about Source, we'll talk about the constellations, the Fae, energy and ley lines, the morphogenic field, and then the Heart's response to all of that. Here's the first path we must follow. We must make it our business to figure out how to describe, to convey in understandable terms, who we are and what we're meant to be. Until we understand that and truly believe and embrace it, we will be at the mercy of those who do nothing but manipulate us. I have been writing and talking about the Fae for some time now, but I'll do it again for those who are just joining the story. Most of this cast of characters and how they truly relate to each other on this earth will be new to you. It's a beautiful story, and you matter most especially in it. Source is just the beginning without end, the divine impetus. I have no better way to describe this right now. I would love to be able to say source is light, but I'm not really sure how meaningful that is, even if I believe it to be absolutely so. And as you know, I do not consider myself to be New Age, as I see that as another new cage. It's a pretext, and there are some ancient pretexts on this planet. Just one of those subjects that has been recast in order to make it impossible to talk about, this idea of light being source. And so I'll try not to fall back on common New Age parlance if possible. The thing is, and then there was light is exactly what it is. The great orchestrator, the magician of harmonies. It's helpful for me to speak of source in terms of music, because music is something I know. Put light through a prism and one sees the light contains all the colors. Each color, I am sure, could be heard if we still had ears to hear. What does red sound like? What does yellow sound like? And so on. In this way, the assault on our resonance chamber also includes our hearing, because I believe we can hear these things, and that ability is part of manifesting. Because of all that it contains, light could easily be thought of as a seed, as would source be thought of as a seed. The great seed, the Ur seed. In the context of what we want to talk about now, we can just think of source as the great or prime initiator. As I said in the beginning, the stars are alive and with us on this planet. The great initiator bade them energize this heart, or this earth, start its heartbeat to beating, and each star being brought here a zone, if you will, of potential, placing it under the most powerful shape for such a task, the dome. 3 times this has happened on the earth. Many tales speak of 3 incarnations of a thing. For example, in the Battle of Moytura, there is said 3 times had Eriu or Ireland lifted her head above the water. What remains of these domes now is the residual light and power. It is like staring at the sun for a very long time. When you turn away finally, the image left is real and powerful and virtual. Long ago, we would have been able to see these domes in actuality. I won't go too far with any of this, as I've gone on about the Fae in 2 previous works, and the earliest beginnings of us, of we, is a subject for iMagician. However, it is germinal to understand what the original point was. Agreeing intuitively that constellations and stars influence us here deeply is no different than accepting astrology. We are each of us a microcosm of the universe, after all, daily taking information from the sun. Over 1,700 domes overlapped each other and covered the surface of the earth. Within each of these other dimensions were easily reached, and the home of a star was a step or a thought away. These were and are light temples. When we realize this and see the earth a little more clearly, it enables us to start fulfilling something humans are supposed to be doing but are not. Regular interaction with these light temples is a kind of planetary maintenance of the visionary geography pattern. The Earth's subtle body needs maintenance, but by humans, to stay pliable and to keep everything in working order, if you will. Under many of the domes, the Earth responded by raising a mountain, an agreed upon maneuver to position the dome in a needed place. The Fae, as I have said, midwived this entire expedition. These are creatures able to seed a planet with human life, with arms and legs and strength. Source bade them come as well, and they were the precursors to the commonly known human being. It was the Fae who gestated within themselves the internal alchemy. It was the Fae who expressed what needed to be expressed, such that the Earth mirrored that expression in some way. We'll talk about that later. My belief is also that the Fae have connections to crop circles, but I'll save that for another day. The Fae were able to draw the ley lines from the energy domes. This is the source of the magnetic energy that are ley lines. This network of light and power allowed them to do their work and ultimately allowed us to do our work. The Earth's visionary geography is a complex receptacle for light. The Fae made and developed different kinds of geomantic sites to tune the light one way or the other. When we get the light ourselves now, this feeds the Earth. One drier way to say this is that we process 24,000 units of biophotonic energy. See how sciencey that sounds? Far less new agey. Gravitas is vital right now. When we get it, the light, everything else gets it. Dogs, cats, flowers, trees, rivers, lakes, insects, bears, through us. Well, you get the picture. We are constantly but subconsciously creating all the time, even now. However, there was a time, not really that long ago, when we could consciously tap into the morphogenic field using thought waves, frequencies we formed ourselves. There are ways to get back to that now, but it takes an act of will. Using our wills even in the smallest things is like climbing Mount Everest, because everything around us is designed to separate us from our own volition. Remember the basic premise. The human imagination is the translator between the morphogenic field and the earthly plane, and the Fae are trying to wake us up. They're trying very, very hard to wake us up. Before moving on, it's important to mention the Earth's response to the domes on her surface. As I've said, often she raised mountains right beneath them, likely for two reasons: to reach what she needed within a particular dome, and to keep it at a particular height for maximal effect. We have holy mountains. We are aware of this. Monks retreat to the mountains for more spiritual power. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. The umbilicus of the world in terms of dome power is Avebury in Wiltshire, a place absolutely locked down and surrounded by the British military, and that is not an accident. The ley lines that shoot out and away from these domes often have a Catholic church sitting right on top of them too, and very often that church has a dome. This was not the Earth's response, but rather the Drach response to locating and trying to piggyback off that energy. What did they use that energy for? Not empowering, as the domes and Fae had done, but to enslave the populace. We have said the stars of the galaxy live on our planet. However, more specifically, all the planets of the solar system exist in the same space as the Earth. Giuliano Conforto, the radical Italian astrophysicist, says that, in fact, what we see as planets out there are more like images in a fractured mirror of spheres that are more like nesting dolls around us. It is this mirror that causes us to see stellar bodies as out there at all, and allows us to experience, describe, and observe in 3 dimensions. I have a slide which you may see soon enough. Conforto says that what we actually see in the night sky is a function of being encased, in a way, in a fractured mirror. That fractured mirror could be nothing more or less than a dodecahedron, a 24-sided shape. These actually occur naturally, believe it or not, although they're very rare, and one can find small versions of them. Rudolf Steiner carried a dodecahedron in his pocket all the time, I'm told. We see reflections of the planets, which are actually all occupying the same space. I postulate as well that the true Big Bang for us occurred when the first humans, the Fae descendants, needed to look at the other entities in the solar system, separate from them, and actually caused what might be considered an exploded view, the fractured mirror, just as one would see an exploded view of a bicycle assembly instructions. This was an acceptance of a 3D moment in time and a necessary step toward objective observation, unlike scientific observation, which often simply means destruction. This Big Bang was almost a hologram, something we could see in front of us as we entered into the 3D reality to do our work. The human resonating chamber is our tool. Once the tone is produced by the vibrating vocal cords, it vibrates in and through the open resonating ducts and chamber. Since the vocal tract is often associated with different regions of the body, different resonance chambers might be referred to as the chest, the mouth, the nose, the mask, or the head. A resonance chamber uses resonance to enhance the transfer of energy from a sound source to the air. The chamber has interior surfaces which reflect an acoustic wave. When a wave enters the chamber, it bounces back and forth within the chamber with low loss. As more wave energy enters the chamber, it combines with and reinforces the standing wave, increasing its intensity. In churches, we sing under domes, do we not? Churches often sit on ley lines, as I said, and are often topped by domes, wherein much singing occurs. Why would that be? The vocal tract is a container of air that starts from the top of the vocal folds and goes all the way to the edge of the lips. We cause the whole thing to vibrate, and not only that, but we can change the tone, the pitch. We can make it short or sustained, loud or soft. Our ability to make sound with that resonance chamber that's our head is endless. Almost every instrument has a resonator. Any container of air that amplifies part of the vibrations counts. The voice has the most unique resonator because it can actively change shape. Once we began to believe that we could not do it, we added instruments to assist us. In music history, one learns of a time when people were absolutely aghast of the sacrilege that the human voice was being replaced by any instrument, and now we know why. However, we are told we cannot sing, and so, humiliated, we do not use this instrument for the rest of our lives. Our sinuses are insulted by toxins, our adenoids are yanked out, again largely due to inflammation. Our tonsils are part of our gear and regularly taken out because in addition to the other things they do, they catch toxins and get rid of them. Our mouths are also our resonance chamber, and our mouths are changed and enslaved to what we jokingly call food. The wisdom teeth are removed. What we put in our mouths dissolves the teeth that remain, and the only thing we think about where our mouths are concerned are perhaps kissing and always eating and drinking. The tongue is arguably one of the most instrumental articulators in the vocal tract. If all other articulators were held still, besides the tongue, most vowels and consonants are still intelligible. The tongue is comprised of 52 muscles and is one of the strongest muscles in the body and one of the more complex parts of the vocal mechanism. It would be job one to get control of that little guy. Not only can we raise a tower of manifestation at a focal point where ley lines meet, but it works in reverse as well. You may have been reminded of this idea that the ley lines were spun out from every dome in many directions. Again, this is a moment when the truly magical, mystical, and exoteric has been made visual by mathematics, and so holds gravitas. These slides, these drawings, this math, this geometry is all going to be in the book and will be in the visual presentation when I can get that going. This is important. It's important in waking up the skeptical. These towers also have a cooling function. Later, when we talk about the fires and heat of creation, remember that this is the case and that there may be a cooling necessary to manifest into the field, from the field into this plane. You'll see the shape, for example, at the sites of nuclear reactors, and the slender part between the bottom and the top is referred to as the throat. There are towers of sound, and they are used in all kinds of magic. Where else have we heard the term Tower of Sound? Right, the music industry, one of the blackest squadrons of human manipulation of the 20th century. Was that Phil Spector? I think it might have been Tower of Sound. Another name for a spirit? Spectre? I think it was. As late as the 20th century, elusive but documented tales of levitation using sound have been documented. The one I like to talk about was the incident where a Swedish doctor visiting Tibetan monks actually watched them building a monastery on top of a very high hill. They, together with 19 various musical instruments, managed this by tone and frequency alone, and there was a film of this at one time, but it was confiscated, of course. Still, there are drawings which I will include, as well as a description. While this is not the same as pulling potential from the field and creating something, it is a good demonstration of what sound can do. Levity versus gravity. Objective evidence abounds now, as this is popular work in science labs. What keeps the knowledge under wraps is that they don't want you to understand that you can do this without an intercessor, whether it be a priest or a scientist or a machine. One of the most compelling cases is that of Henry Kilson, a Swedish engineer, who detailed in a book in 1961 titled The Lost Techniques, a visit of his friend, a Dr. Jarl, a Swedish doctor, to a Tibetan monastery. And while at that monastery, Dr. Jarl is the one who witnessed Tibetan monks levitating large stones from the ground up to a cliff approximately 250 meters high. This account of stone levitation is remarkable because of the scientific observations and measurements that were documented by Jarl. The detailed measurements allow for analysis of geometric proportions used by the monks. The following excerpt comes from the book. In the middle of the meadow, about 250 meters from the cliff, was a polished slab of rock with a bowl-like cavity in the center. The bowl had a diameter of 1 meter and a depth of 15 centimeters. A block of stone was maneuvered into this cavity by yak oxen. The block was 1 meter wide and 1.5 meters tall. Then, 19 musical instruments were set in an arc of 90 degrees at a distance of 63 meters from the stone slab. The radius of 63 meters was measured out accurately. The musical instruments consisted of 13 drums and 16 trumpets, also known as ragdons. 8 drums had a cross-section of 1 meter and a length of 1.5 meters. 4 drums were medium-sized with a cross-section of 0.7 meters and a length of 1 meter. The only small drum had a cross-section of 0.2 meters and a length of 0.3 meters. All the trumpets were the same size. They had a length of 3.12 meters and an opening of 0.3 meters. The big drums and all the trumpets were fixed on mounts which could be adjusted with staffs in the direction of the slab of stone. The big drums were made of 3 millimeter thick sheet iron and had a weight of 150 kilograms. They were built in 5 sections, while the other end had a bottom of metal on which the monks beat with big leather clubs. Behind each instrument was a row of monks. The situation was demonstrated via diagram, which will be in the visual rendition of the lecture and also in the book. When the stone was in position, the monk behind the small drum gave a signal to start the concert. The small drum had a very sharp sound and could be heard even with the other instruments making a terrible racket. All the monks were singing and chanting a prayer, and slowly increasing the tempo of this unbelievable noise. During the first 4 minutes, nothing happened. Then at the speed of the drumming and the noise increased, the big stone block started to rock and sway, and suddenly it took off into the air with an increasing speed in the direction of the platform in front of the cave hole 250 meters high. After 3 minutes of ascent, it landed on the platform. Continuously, they brought new blocks to the meadow, and the monks using this method transported 5 to 6 blocks per hour as a parabolic flight track approximately 500 meters long and 250 meters high. From time to time, a stone split, and the monks moved the split stones away. Personally, I find the account very compelling because there are a lot of details, as well as a group of measurements that can be analyzed, regardless of whether the whole thing is fiction or not. The geometry can speak for itself. From the side view, the ground and cliff form two sides of nested right triangles. The distance between the instruments to the stone was 63 meters, and that's about a quarter the distance from the stone to the cliff base, which is 250 meters. Consider the base of the cliff as the center of two circles, with two triangle legs as radii. The circle diameters as well as the triangle legs are in the ratio of 5:4. These two circles in a linear ratio of 5:4 are seen repeatedly in crop circles and megalithic monuments around the world. One significance of this set of circles is that they provide an easy approximation for squaring the circle. See, I can't say in the figure above, you can't see it yet. I've often wondered why squaring the circle would play such a prominent role in crop circles, ancient architecture, and monuments. Recently, I've come to realize that the angles encoded within this geometric structure may play a key role in nonlinear resonance because they are an embodiment of the golden ratio. That's nature's fractal. The angle formed by the musicians, point of levitation, and base of the cliff, which is 51.38 degrees, is very close to the angle seen in a vertical cross-section of the Great Pyramid of Giza, 51.83 degrees. Cultural myths allege that the stone used to build this pyramid were levitated into place, so the geometric similarity is interesting to note. The vertical cross-section of the Great Pyramid of Giza appears to be composed of two triangles known as Kepler triangles. A Kepler triangle is the only right triangle with sides in a geometric progression according to the golden ratio. Geometrically speaking, Kepler's triangle is the embodiment of the golden ratio in more ways than the golden triangle some readers may be familiar with. The question remains about the geometric intent of the Tibetan monks, assuming the story is true. Were the monks using a 5:4 ratio to approximate the geometric progression of the golden ratio? A comparison of the triangles in question show how close they all are. The connection between Kepler triangles and resonance will be the future of further discussion. Some of this I just have to skip because you can't see it. Anyway, the drums, the monks, the singing, the angles, from a musical theory point of view, it makes perfect sense to use the ratio 3:2, 3:2 beat, a 3:2 beat for proportioning instruments because it represents one of the most important musical intervals, the perfect fifth. The musical system supposedly developed by Pythagoras, but likely borrowed from the Babylonians, relied entirely on powers of 2 and 3. This three-limit tuning system was the dominant music theory used up until the Renaissance, where it was supplanted by an equal temper tuning system that allowed for easier key changes. What we do not know anymore is that there is an ongoing alchemy within us all the time. Much of the reason for that in this century is that the medical profession has taken custody of our insides. We're led to believe, and we really do believe, that everything inside us is mysterious, foreign, and well beyond our control. Whatever is in there has a mind of its own, does what it wants to do, and interacts with other mysterious agents in a dance between health and terminal illness. How disempowered we are. Prior to that, it was the church and our enslavement to agrarian practices. We think of alchemy as our use of one material substance to change or influence another material substance, all happening very much outside our bodies. There are tales of the philosopher's stone and the use of alchemical principles to make gold. In fact, we feel that only the rare, gifted, and very special are able to understand and use alchemical principles outside ourselves, using outside substances to affect other outside substances, when we are quite simply a breathtaking internal alchemical symphony, of which we have full charge. All of us. Other than being completely severed in our conscious mind from what's happening inside, I ask you, what is it outside ourselves that makes us feel we must change one thing into another? What is it that we lack or need that would require this strange, and I would say foreign practice of a magic that was at one time entirely internal? It has been our job to manifest what hasn't yet taken form in the material and enliven what is already there. That means give to, add to, stimulate what's already there. We pull potential from the morphogenic plane and manifest perfection right here on Earth. Much of the case I present is based on my position that it is our job to transform our holy landscape. Not in the way of turning wood into gold or useless waste of time, what that would be. The job description has really gotten away from us. Our job is to transform light in order to enliven everything around us, including other living beings and the earth itself. We inform all of these. We inform all of these as well, since the source of some of our light is our own sun, which is connected to all other suns, carrying universal knowledge. We do this through the generation of what is known as ki. From the sun to ki. That's the primary result of our taking in biophotonic energy. Our internal alchemy drives this process. Within, we carry the principles and the abilities of fire, of water, of air, and of earth. All of the elementals live within us. They are expressed inwardly as salt, heat, fat, and acid. They are expressed outwardly through what we are known as temperaments: choler, sanguinity, melancholia, and phlegma. There is a corollary response from the earth as she mirrors us with her elementals. These are the gnomes, the salamanders, the sylphs, and the undines, or earth, fire, air, and water, respectively. Just as the star bodies energizing an area within a dome elicited the response of a rising mountain from the earth, the exercising of our natural inner alchemy is met by a response from the earth and her elemental beings. This is balance. Magic is always mirrored. That which lives within us is practical and real and used, not just theoretical. It's not some ancient tale in a big dusty book. When this part of the esoteric dance we do with our world became exoteric, when we were yoked to the grain fields and learned to cook objects in the world and eat them, we began using our natural alchemical abilities outside ourselves, and in so doing forgot our inner selves. We did so because we had to change the matter in some way to be able to take it into ourselves. Human beings do not digest anything. There is a colony of gut bacteria that demolishes what we put in there. For itself, not for us. The human being is not capable of what we call digestion. The alchemical elements, their elemental counterparts, and their representative colors are as follows: salt, yellow, sanguine, and sylph. Heat goes to red, goes to choler, goes to salamander. Fat goes to green, goes to phlegm, goes to gnome. Acid goes to blue, goes to melancholia, goes to undine. We should talk about heat first, as it goes to the fire principle. The salamander, the choleric temperament. Why first? Because fire is creation, ignition, genesis. What does heat do? It elevates and levitates, as levity is the opposite of gravity. Without levity, we would be pinioned to the earth. Without this principle of heat and levity, we would have no hope of throwing off the yoke of being chained to the earth in unnatural ways. Why do you think we laugh and spend so much time making each other laugh? Imagine the despair of our beloved earth and of the Fae and the star being to see that a prison for us could be fashioned on the very surface of the mother we love so much. If we were to use scientific terms, we might say that heat makes molecules dance faster and move farther away from each other. Fire, even in the beautiful aspect of a candle flame, casts no shadow of itself. What does this heat also do inside our bodies? Well, that's very important. It creates higher temperatures to deal with imbalances within. That's what a fever is, actually. A fever restores balance, eliminates invaders, and even catapults us to the next developmental level as we grow. In this world, we shove fever reducers down our child's throat at the merest sign. Developmental fevers are very real. Fevers can briefly show us other worlds, even when we're not children. Color can make your blood boil. That red would be the representative color of fire should be no surprise. Despite the fact that fire has so very many colors in it, it's never still essence. But it is the color that stimulates the fire principle within us, red. Human beings are born with all four temperaments present within their personality. One or two will be stronger than the others. That's because a person resonates to one alchemical principle more strongly than others. And that has to do with destiny. It's not an accident or a roll of the dice. One brings in with oneself the tools necessary to fulfill the job should one decide to follow through. Lots of the depression around us is the very bad decision not to follow through, but that's helped along by the madness outside ourselves aimed at us. Joseph Campbell talked about the hero's journey refused. Frankly, we don't even remember there's a hero's journey to take after the nightmare of the birthing process, which is where they get us. Fire creates, heart heat keeps things moving. We may come to this earth with a high degree of choleric temperament. A choleric person is loud, sure of themselves, quick to action, usually right, but annoyingly so, and in defense of this character, this is the very knight that will ride over the hill to save you. In medieval kitchens, which we will get to in a bit, choler was associated with yellow bile as its humor and treated as such with food to bring it into balance. Earth's mirror of this energy is what's called the salamander. It is the elemental that has to do with fire and the spark of creation. Creation is a violent act in a way, as it causes something to come from nothing. Elementals, or the physical manifestations of the natural elements, possess energies that embody their element. Salamanders are the elemental of fire. This concept is purported to come from the scientist Paracelsus in the 16th century. I can imagine it's been around since the dawn of time, since the earth mirrored what we brought with us in human form. However, it would be very interesting to know what Paracelsus wrote about these things. How do we use the principle of heat outside ourselves? To heat our bodies and keep our outsides warm, we melt things like metal and glass in order to create new objects, to cook meat and other things we call food, to use the principle of heat and fire in order to render objects outside ourselves changed enough to go into our bodies, for destruction, I might say, rather than creation. Legend has it that the salamanders taught us how to make fire when we became severed from our inner alchemy. From then, we came to see the elementals as completely outside ourselves and having to do with Mother Earth, but nothing to do with us, when in fact they are simply our mirror. Salt is an extraordinarily important subject. We are saline creatures, after all. Our amniotic fluid, our blood, is quite saline. 90-some% of our body is water, and saline at that. We have the ability to conduct frequency and current via our saline selves. In the Liber de Nymphos of the Philosophia Magna, Paracelsus discusses the characteristics of the elementals at length. Interestingly, he says sylphs are rougher, coarser, taller, and stronger than humans. The elementals are said to be able to move through their own elements as human beings move through the air. That's true. Because of this, sylphs are the closest to humans in his conception, because they move through air like we do. While in fire, they burn, in water they drown, and in earth they get stuck. My understanding of the sylphs is simply that they are of the air, which is simply a less dense plasma than earth or water. I'm not actually clear as to what he was saying. This certainly could have been the Tuatha which I have discussed at length in previous works. And if one can see the earth elementals, the gnomes, then there's no reason to think the sylphs cannot be seen. Paracelsus was quite connected to the Untersberg in Austria. I'm going back there in September to continue my research. It towers above Salzburg, which means the city of salt. The sanguine expression of elemental expertise is simply a nimble-footed being of joy. It is important to bring joy to this planet and every living creature on it. That's the business of the sanguine. However, they are distractible and never start or finish anything properly. They're like tinkling bells, really. Despite the fact that we have taken the word sanguine to mean of the blood, their color is yellow. Perhaps it is the color keeps the blood flowing and sanguine fills it with joy. Or salt. Salt, which is in this category, is fundamental to life. Blood, water, anything that conducts a frequency through our body. Salt keeps our joints supple and facilitates the travel of current to the nerve endings. Some say that salt is the philosopher's stone, simple as that. How do we use salt outside ourselves? To flavor food, to melt ice, to cure meat so that we can take it into our bodies without damage. Salt, in fact, in its original state, which is sea salt, is the antidote to sugar. Often when we crave salt, that's the reason. We know we've been poisoned and we're taking steps. The melancholic expression of alchemical processes is the acid, perhaps even the sulfur. Alchemists say that it is a reaction of sulfur and mercury, melancholy and sanguinity in a way, that creates salt at all. Melancholy is just what we have come to think it is. Aloneness, aloofness, silence, a bit of hypochondria and sadness, represented by the color blue and the vast, vast ocean. Melancholics are so allergic to social interaction, which they almost always see as criticism, that they won't even attempt something unless they feel they can be perfect the first time. They are truly blue much of the time. The world is at fault, of course, never themselves, and there are generally many tears and much self-pity. Not surprisingly, it is the undines, which were the earth's reflection of the melancholic temperament. The undines are present in everything that flows, whether it's the sap in a tree, or a tear that falls, or the rain beating on your roof, or even the mighty Niagara. I'd say the mighty Niagara was a function of the sylphs and the undines together, though. Finally, we have the expression of our inner alchemy that aligns itself with the earth, with phlegm, and with the soil and mineral life. This is the phlegmatic impulse, which is found mirrored in the gnomes, the dwellers of the earth and protectors of the mineral world. 'Tis the opposite of fire, the opposite of the fire principle. Another word for gnomes is diminutive spirit. I like that very much, as Walt Disney has got hold of the word gnome and completely destroyed it. That and everything else that has to do with understanding the weight of what we're discussing. The color that reflects the diminutive spirit, as well as the alchemical equivalent inside us, is green. Green is the earth, health, growth, and all of that. A volcano is a cooperation of the fire principle and the earth principle. Very serious business indeed. The phlegmatic has its alchemical corollary in fat. Fat makes things go. Fat gives things flavor. Fat allows things to happen. Recently, a scientist at the University of Calgary discovered or realized that fat has light receptors. Therefore, fat plays an enormously important part within us to collect those biophotons. People are definitely realizing that fat is not the enemy at all. Not really. The purpose of alchemy is to strip down the self to nothingness, leaving everything bare to be scrutinized. By gaining self-knowledge about one's nature and one's relation to self and source, the soul is reformed, the impurities expunged, and it is united into a pure and undivided thing. That is the purpose of alchemy. It may well be that externalizing our alchemy was, at first, an attempt to purify the poisons which had got into us and return our pure connection to the source. It would be perfect to think we'd done that quite on purpose, however astray it all may have gone as the centuries went by. The point has been to fracture us, divide us internally, and so on. So this does make sense to me. The oldest documentation of the art of living without food is found in the Chinese Taoist tradition, well over 2,000 years ago. And I bring up the subject of food here because we just discussed the externalization of our alchemy and the crippling of our internal alchemy. And that, in my point of view, my feeling and my belief, is that came with the introduction of something that has been termed food. Anyway, the art of living without food in the Chinese Taoist tradition, well over 2,000 years ago, is called bigu, whereas the tradition today is that bigu is an achievement, and certainly today one could look at it that way. I feel that this is our original state of being. Bigu literally means avoid grains, but is accepted generally as meaning avoid all food. In China, as elsewhere, there's a strong corollary between the state of bigu and the mountains. Certainly this makes sense in light of our discussion today. Bigu is not achieved anyway by force. People will tell you that your mind allows it, your body allows it. Bigu is a return to a natural state of being rather than a conscious denial of food. That said, it does not mean it isn't necessary to consciously and deeply get our situation. In fact, it's vital to our redemption as human beings. Taoists say he or she who is filled with qi needs no food. It's necessary to explain as much as possible the lore of bigu because it is a iridescent example. There came a clear point of transition from one thing to another. The Taoists recall an Eden-like state before the cultivation of grains. Then Confucius arrived on the scene, took up residence in the royal courts, and rewrote history for the sake of the emperor. He wrote of a miserable, hungry, death-filled, disease-ridden existence that changed magically with the introduction of the cultivation of grains. In fact, Taoists speak of very, very long-lived people prior to that. And here we have both a clear example of pretext, upon which a great social enslavement was built, and we also have an example of how long the planning has been in effect. Scarcity is a brilliant tactic. Mysticism and diet have a complicated relationship from ritual meals to food taboos. The shaman or priest's knowledge of stars and seasons dictated planting and harvesting, as well as the precise time of hunting expeditions or nomadic wanderings. And this was post-Taoism, however. As civilization emerged from loose-knit horticultural hunter-gatherers to hierarchical agriculture settlements, the accumulated wisdom from plant-animal husbandry to medical knowledge would form part of the basis for an authority literally rooted in the peasants' struggle against the earth. There's your change. There's your spinning on a dime, turning on a dime right there. So we came from being indispensable components of enlivening the earth, the heart, to peasants rooted in a struggle against her. It's an awful thing. Suddenly we, as celestial shepherds of this beautiful earth, are now locked in mortal combat with it. Desperate to beat her into submission and make her host this parasite, which will then ingest, but actually what we will do is give almost all of it to whatever feudal lord owns the bit of land we're working, and then he will sell it back to us. All of this is dependent on both the introduction of agricultural pursuits or farming and the idea that we've crossed a bridge wherein we need some sort of intercessor with nature and the stars. This turning point was cataclysmic in separating us from our true selves. And do remember, if you're old enough, that until very, very recently, one could not use human waste as compost. It simply did not belong under the soil. It would not feed the earth. The Taoist immortals are often described as abstaining from grain as part of their training and progression in the Tao. I wish to immediately point out that cultivated cereal grains are a relatively recent addition to the human diet and represent a radical departure from the foods to which we were genetically adapted, if there are actually any of those. But what would those so-called foods be? Additionally, why is it necessary for us to exoterically practice alchemy in order to consume these so-called foods to which we're genetically adapted? We cook it, salt it, pickle it, add fat to it to make it more palatable. Beyond the tension of the raw versus the cooked is the fundamental dreariness and difficulty of an agricultural existence. The book of Genesis in chapter 2 implies that man's very creation was anticipated to work the fields, possibly indicating that it was his sole purpose at that early stage of creation. And there was not a man to till the ground. Adam of the red dirt is punished for tasting the forbidden fruit, with the odious warning that in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. Many ancient myths describe rituals and rites seeking to arbitrate and articulate the deep sense of misery of man's fall from a garden of plenty into the sorrows of hell on earth. Research reveals the complex relationship between families, bloodlines, human and plant husbandry, and the wilder side of weeds, harlots, and sex outside the state reproductive paradigms. A discussion on vegetarianism as an act of political revolt outside the communal sharing of blood sacrifice as refusing society is extremely relevant as context to this discussion of the Taoist practice of bigu. There's a significant body of literature in Jewish and Islamic sources that identify the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden as wheat. There's surely some statement for a prejudice against the agriculture in the refusal of Cain's offering. Cain was the tiller of the soil, whose name means to acquire, get, or possess, identical to the word for spear, and cognate with to forge and read or stalk, and associations that are found in this Chinese context. I believe it may have been George Cavassalis who stated that wheat was brought from elsewhere. It's not native to this planet. Of course, not all agricultural myths tend toward the depressing. Many involve gods or legendary heroes who spread the beneficent technologies and civilizing acts of mercy to a wild, desperate, and starving population. Shenong, which literally means divine farmer, the legendary emperor of the 5 grains, helped the masses of starving huddled in the bush to learn the secrets of plants, organizing a pharmacopoeia as well as a teaching agriculture. There's an organizing principle at work, combining the idea of a hierarchy, an emperor, and dynastic families that trace their origin to them, and the subservient collective that must join together in order to root out and destroy the weeds that covered the land. They must cut down the fleabane, the mugwort, the false hemp, the star thistle, Johnny Appleseed, which seems a bit terrifying at this point. But remember, in the Battle of Moytura, 365 herbs were lost, stomped on, scattered to the 4 winds. Each herb, an herb for each day and an herb for each part of our body. Contrasted to the cursed punishment of agriculture of biblical myths is the Chinese notion of a divine nutritional salvation that rescued the population from living the savaged lives of beasts and scavengers. Divine nutritional salvation. If this is not still what we constantly seek, heroes and divinities such as Shenong and who I think it's Hao Qi, the lord of millet grains, would receive special sacrifices as tribute that would be collected by families and tribes that appropriated the gods' clout to legitimize their rule. Millet appears to be the only grain to have been deified in ancient China. There's also broader evidence of an Indo-European praise of famous grains in various mythological contexts, and if one didn't grow the millet, one could not sacrifice to the gods, and then where would we be? What becomes evident in the study of this line drawn between Confucianism and Taoism is a fundamental difference in their assessments of the prehistoric period of China. The Confucians viewed primordial times as periods of starvation, of violence, and wilderness, contrasted to the Taoist view of a golden age of uncontrived, Eden-like bliss. The idyllic age was expressed with these words: spirits and gods showed their goodwill, and nobody dies before his time. This is anathema to the Confucian view, that it took a civilizing divine potentate to rescue humanity from its own ignorance and helplessness in a brutal wilderness. And there, my friends, is classic savior programming, which is the most classic Drac technique of assimilation. And when I say Drac, I mean Draco. This expresses a fundamental cosmological orientation that is the foundation for much of the social movements in China and everywhere else in the world, even into modern times. Ancient man imbibed dew and fed on primordial breath and drank harmony, and ate not the toilsome, vulgar crops of the red dust that are exemplified in the 5 sacred grains. Now the people of mysterious antiquity, they reached old age because they remained in leisure and never ate any grains. That transition to cutting stalks at noontime, perspiration drips to the earth. Know you that your bowl of rice, each grain from hardship comes. The peasant was yoked to the earth in a diabolical scheme of death and taxes and back-breaking labor in furtherance of the state agenda. When famine or natural disaster altered the already precarious relationship between man and the land, it was the poor who bore the brunt of the burden. This eventually birthed the Escalantist movement. That is to say, when the situation became critical, there was an exodus to the holy mountains. This should not surprise us. The sedentary existence of an agricultural society was at the mercy of the elements and prey to all manner of social ills and class exploitation. The gifts of beneficent legendary emperors is bittersweet, and the paradox at the heart of this relationship informs much of Taoist cosmology and practice. If the 5 grains are taken literally as representing rice, glutinous millet, panicled millet, wheat, and soybeans, then it must be noted that all these foods require significant cultivation, farming, and converted land. This must be kept in mind when discussing the wild, uncultivated foods of the Taoist adepts, such as pine resin, needles and nuts, and fantastic mushrooms and minerals, all certainly to be found on the holy mountains. Famines, plagues, wars, and corrupt, ineffectual governments characterized much of China's history from the prehistorical period. After the fall of the Han Dynasty, more and more people refrained from eating cereals. The Han Tun myths painted a picture of the formation of class distinctions and described the atmosphere of imposing a feudal system that crystallized some of core facets of the Taoist immortal Zhu Yan of the 4th century, who wrote of his cosmological theories that related grain to earth and qi to the heavens, thus making them incompatible. Therefore, the adept sought to ingest a higher or more refined type of qi, connected to the heavens. Beyond this, the leisurely Taoist might take a dismal view of the cost-benefit ratio of labor-intensive agriculture. The uncertain situation of a tumultuous social order would eventually leave all classes from emperor down to some degree at the mercy of a fate ultimately linked to diet. The nostalgia for a primitive golden age inspired mass revolts on one level, often resulting in the disaster for all parties, and a hermit's seclusion on the other. As more and more land was converted to agrarian pursuits, the mountains became the potent symbols of the wild, natural, and untainted source of power. Eventually, monastic orders arose as a compromise between the secular and spiritual realms, many secreting themselves away on a holy mountain. Retiring to a mountain, then as now, would require an inordinate amount of training, planning, and discipline, but this essentially puts the person back in the same situation as before the advent of agriculture. The Taoist masters in some sense decided that in the face of the continually crumbling social order with intermittent prosperity, to have done with the charade and to face the situation on their own terms. To be able to minimize or abstain from food, especially the 5 grains, and to thrive by way of subtle arts would be tantamount to freedom from the feudal system. I emphasize to thrive here because it's quite different from some forced fast where the person simply wastes away. From the time of the Yellow Emperor, and especially in a Confucian context, there existed the legendary rebels who would not submit and thus were exiled by force to remote lands. These mystic incorrigibles are the prototypical source for eccentric and lunatic adepts that inhabit Chinese history. The legendary rebels were part of metalworking confraternities or metallurgical initiatory brotherhoods, who were leaders of pre-feudal collectivist society and would have attempted to resist the earliest feudal lords and to prevent them from acquiring metalworking as the basis of their power. This provides much of the symbolism and vocabulary for the various mystical alchemies, inner and outer, that used metallurgical technical terms as code. Metalworking as well as blacksmithing comes up again and again and again, especially among the peoples who set out from Ireland originally and eventually peopled the earth. Finally, I just want to mention a couple of things that are biblical. Here's a lovely statement. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Likewise, the abstention from grain of the saints must be seen to be a fundamental technique of achieving immortality, perhaps only inferior to a magical plant or elixir that would instantly fulfill the same function as the practice of bigu. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or the ritual of eating. We did not always eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Of course, you know that I contend that we didn't always eat objects outside ourselves on this earth at all. Earlier, we discussed the potential of the apple in the garden and what that could have been, what I surely think it was. To me, this was the transition from Tao to Confucius, from idyllic Eden to being yoked to the soil. And the irresistible lure was simply and sadly sugar. We've had a look at the history that was Taoist bigu into Confucian landholding and yoking the people to scratch the soil and bring grains up out of her unwilling soul. She's not suited to a monocultural patchwork quilt across her skin, and we well know that. First it was a stick that scraped a wound into her side, and then the poor old animals forced to drag knives behind them, making deeper cuts. Or perhaps we can conjure an image of a peasant standing knee-deep in water, tending rice plants. By flummoxing the common person, who now became a slave, or a serf, or a peasant, convincing them that if they did not have grain they would surely die, they created a slave class filled with fear. That's quite a jump from one attitudinal human to another. And introducing grains into the body caused inflammation everywhere. So they simply began a cruel dream in which the magic, as with the Doida, truly slept. The serfs who worked like dray horses in the fields did eat food, or try to help them continue their labors. Monarchical systems tethered to the Roman Church and further locked down the human spirit. Shackled to an agrarian existence, they prayed to this Catholic God to improve their lot in life and to supply them with a never-ending source of grain, really the height of irony. The origins of breakfast are buried deep in our collective past. The Catholic Church insisted that we not break our fast until after Mass. What Mass exactly were they filling us with, I wonder? But that was not the extent of their tentacles by any means. It wasn't just when you ate, but what you were allowed to eat. Breakfast, bacon and eggs was surely the first, and that was the clergy's fault too. Roughly half the year you could not eat meat at all. You could eat fish, which as a living entity strikes me as odd that it's not considered to be meat, but meat was forbidden, supposedly because it was the product of procreation, and so would make one think of sex. I truly doubt that was the germinal idea. If we believe an alien anti-human presence appeared on this planet, which I certainly do, there would have been a desire to remove anything from us that empowered us in ways they did not want us empowered. Take away the spark plugs, clog the lines, to get just enough to keep us, the new herd, in a condition to be able to do what was wanted, but just barely. At any rate, filling up on eggs and scraps of meat right before Lent led to the bacon and egg breakfast. 'Twas all applied to affect us, so that we could be herded in one direction or another, and that was done, as always, through addiction and fear. It was here, when records indicate the use of salt to cure meat. This is something I invite you to think about. The 17th century saw the rise of salt-cured pork. But before that, food cemented the hierarchy that had developed due to the agrarian revolution. There were early references to breakfast, such as choristers at St. Paul's Cathedral being given bread and ale if they'd been up singing the night before. In 1297, there was a reference of a grand breakfast being served by a noblewoman in her vast banqueting hall to about 120 people, with some ceremony, largesse, and basic showing off. 20 poor people were invited to go back out and spread the word. After the Reformation, the Catholic restrictions went away, and so recipes for all the forbidden foods began to appear. 20 recipes for omelets, for example, in one household. Cooking took place still over an open fire, with foods nestled in the ashes and such. New cookware appeared, as well as the first official cookbook, with 1,000 recipes for forbidden food. The ship was helmed by Henry VIII, a master of mega overindulgence in all things, and the Tudors were peacocks, if nothing else. Quite a reaction when the children had broken out of Sunday school, so to speak. However, back to breakfast, back to the medieval kitchen. Food was not considered to be just fuel or even fuel at all. People believed the body could be cured by food, and cooks were actually healers. The body was composed of humors which needed balancing: earth, air, fire, and water. Humors were internal. Yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood in the human body. This meant cooking things in a certain way to bring about the desired effect. We can imagine easily what it was like to be hungry after Mass, after the dark filling of the empty insides, and then a meal, perhaps a hot meal, before we went off to work for the Master. However, over the last few centuries, we've ended up with 3 meals a day, and often little snacks in between. Yeah, it matters in a way what we're eating, but it matters even more that we're always eating. How did that happen? Not much changed regarding the first meal of the day until the early 19th century, when appeared an American called John Harvey Kellogg. As a devout Seventh-day Adventist, he swore to save us all from ourselves and turn us into vegetarians. Along came then cornflakes. He intended to serve them only to his guests at the sanatorium he owned, but his younger brother added malt and sugar to the mix, marketed it all to the general public, and the nightmare of cold, sugary breakfast cereal was born. Frosted Flakes was quickly followed by Cocoa Puffs. These days, people slam down a lunch in about 12 minutes. They're not even sure what it's for, but pushing it in as fast as possible only makes things worse. Lunch is a function of the business class in a city, so as another class of workers developed, another meal developed. The Industrial Revolution by mid-19th century was at the bottom of this. These were new living and working patterns. Commuting had begun with the trains. But then they had a full hour for lunch. The serfs and peasantry had breakfast. The middle and lower middle classes took breakfast and lunch. It's important to remember that food had to be eaten during daylight hours, until the invention of the electric lamp for the most part. Lunch was dinner, taken at around 10 a.m., after 5 hours of hard work. And then supper was a light meal at 4 p.m. Hunting, growing, and cooking food, then perhaps buying it, and definitely eating it, really occupied all thoughts in a day, and it still does. This was the timing of the meals for a few hundred years, actually. We remember that in the early modern period of the late 17th century, Catholicism was replaced by Protestantism. We managed to live through Henry VIII and his descendants. However, with the rise of Charles II to the throne, food became truly trendy, truly about class, social change, and social climbing. It was about taste and style and not about balancing humors. The main meal was creeping later in the day, anytime between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. We see the rise of the true gourmand for the first time. We might even be able to equate the appearance of breakfast with primary school and the appearance of the gourmand with middle school, for that is when our astral begins to cry to be born, and all our longings to be popular and elevated in some way, to stand out. Well, I think the analogy holds rather well. And we see the rise of the creme de la creme, the paragon of meats, of venison for the nobility. They had a total monopoly. They owned every park, every forest, and every deer. There is a connection between the spirit of an animal, the gesture of an animal, and the desire to eat it. The merchant class vied and clamored for the wealthy meal of venison, hoping to take on the essence and gesture of nobility purely by what they ate. What was lost in the translation was that there's no thanking of the animal for using its body for sustenance. It wasn't the animal's spirit that was to be desired after all. It was the panache and entitlement of the noble classes. Mostly one was unlucky about snagging a deer, and there was a high price to pay for poaching one. Hence, the tradition of marinating meat in red wine was developed to fool people into thinking they were eating venison. Continuing the theme of the midday meal, the Victorians became quite concerned about the health of the human herd, when half of those who volunteered for the Boer Wars were rejected for being too small and rather malnourished. They responded to this by the inception of the school lunch, and by World War II their stock for war was back to optimal level. You will hear the same theme echoed today at the Council for Foreign Relations, which body wants to make sure they have enough healthy, trainable stock for war, and they openly say that. When we added the evening meal, it was finally all about social aspirations and showing off, only made possible by the advent of the electric light. All pretense was thrown to the wind. From the mid to late 20th century, we became obsessed with what kind of food, when, how often, desperately trying to find some way to do this dance with food that worked. Rationing after the war set us up for a scarcity infection and a longing for nice things. The dinner party, for example, is our grandest and showiest meal, the one we most associate with theater and ritual. It signals how we position ourselves amongst our peers. Private dinners reinforce a belonging to a club of some sort. This is a living microcosm of 1,000 years of ritual dining, and it all takes place at night. Performance aspects, culinary prowess, the dinner party, no matter how large or small, was pure theater. It was here that the rituals were the most intricate and the price for failure was the highest. And to think we were meant to live on light alone. How far we've been dragged down a path, really an abattoir of our own. Weaponized anthropology, how to change a culture. Starting with Franz Boas and his protege, Margaret Mead, the infant social science of anthropology became a weapon in the hands of those who would steer a culture in whatever way suited their agenda. There is quite a large discussion on this in my book, Dangerous Imagination, Silent Assimilation. Please do have a deep look at that. We all need to. Personally, I no longer view this as a new thing relative to the 20th century. I think this has been going on since the Drac handed Eve an apple. Anthropologists discovered that a people's food and how they eat, why they eat, and so forth was an extremely important piece of social leverage. Combine that with the slick machinations of the propaganda machine and the newer toy store of media manipulation, and the stage was set for keeping that yoke firmly on our backs. What to eat, when, how, what did your food say about you as a person? Were you worthwhile or not? Intelligent or not? Discriminating or not? As with all potent propaganda and social change machines, the subject got right up in our emotions, in our astral life. After all, we have scarcity and such, but what is it we really long for? Approval. It was about this time that a certain echelon of humanity wanted to be looked upon as intelligentsia, reading all the right books, being very urbane, and more than a little cynical and snide, and traveling in the rarefied circles which certainly included the elite food habits. But someone had to line those up for us. Charismatic chefs and television helped us all feel that we could get a toe in there, rise above our station, and just know what the chic, hip, cool thing to do was. You know, the elite habit, as in any closed club, of acting like they had a secret, a very important secret, that was the key to everything. But of course you couldn't have it. Well, that greased the wheels. In fact, the television chefs were inventing chic as they went along. Some with motives driven by less than scrupulous players behind the scenes, and undoubtedly with some whispering, or even a script written, apparently, at some government agency. This was the advent of the Cold War, remember? And entire agencies were now dedicated to disrupting cultures via arts and letters. No reason not to control all cultures, even our own, right? We had agencies for cultural affairs, we had the U.S. Information Service, and so on, all offshoots of the OSS, which became the CIA. But first came the Army. They used to say an army marches on its stomach. Bet that means something different to you now. The armed forces were a test bed for mass-produced garbage, instant coffee, energy bars, stacked potato chips, like Pringles, sliced bread stabilized for shelf life, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, dehydrated foods, which were then packed into meal kits, powdered eggs, powdered milk, powdered potatoes, canned meat, canned fish, cheese powder, with tons of leftovers sold after the war and turned into Cheetos and mac and cheese, M&Ms because they didn't melt in your hand. Food techs at Natick Center in Massachusetts turned gristle and bone into a meat substitute that's now sold as the McRib sandwich at Mickey D's. Bone and sinew ground to flakes, then reconstituted with spices. Yum. Prepackaged salad, prepackaged ramen for Asian armies, hardtack, juice boxes. The list is endless, and frankly, the inner aisles of the supermarket are quite literally populated with this garbage. Now, back to anthropological warfare. There's much evidence that the use of culture and art and print magazines had a great effect on the world, not necessarily a good effect, and that many, many writers and artists were in the pay of these agencies. This is very reminiscent of the situation in the movie and music industry now, isn't it? Today's publishers are owned by the government, and for the most part, and act as gatekeepers. I would not have signed any of my books with a publishing house knowing they would just get buried. The same holds true for turning anything into a screenplay. With the real advent of television, we were introduced to a new spectacle. We must talk about the mass media advent of the celebrity chef. Fanny Craddock came first, apparently, in the UK. She was cooking in performance with some comedy thrown in, as she and her husband did a comedy magic show on stage with a chic dinner produced voila at the end. It was 1956 or maybe earlier. Theoretically, this phenomenon was due to the fact that at the end of the 50s and beginning of the 60s, a generation of women emerged who had never been taught to cook for the pleasure of it. After the war, they'd had a decade of making do with sparse, third-rate ingredients. Supposedly, this woman would give other women the confidence to cook. Once again, the idea was to show off using food. She offered snobbery. In 2007, a film came out, which for a long time was one of my favorites. It was called Julie and Julia. It wasn't until maybe a year ago, or a little longer, that I began to really see what I was looking at. In 2008, the list of personnel from the Office of Strategic Services was made public. The OSS was the precursor to the CIA. It was made up of artists, teachers, sociologists, lawyers, linguists, writers, and so on. It was a social sciences branch of the U.S. intelligence headed by a man called Wild Bill Donovan. Working directly under him was one Julia McWilliams. She worked directly for him and had control over thousands of personnel files. Her future husband, Paul Childs, worked directly for Lord Mountbatten at that time, although the future husband and wife were stationed together. After the war, Donovan and a man called Gregory Bates, married to Margaret Mead, formed the CIA. Gregory Bates was openly of the Tavistock Institute, that war machine, and the cultural propaganda machine. As I watched the movie again after becoming aware of this news, there was a scene that said it all. After the war, Paul was assigned to Paris, the USIS Cultural Propaganda Division. What I watched was an exhibition he'd put together. He and Julia standing in a receiving line thanking people for coming, and a quote-unquote Jack Donovan came through the line. Paul then introduced him to Julia as if they had never met. The idea that they were spies is brought up at a dinner party in the film and dismissed. This movie was preemptive damage control, meant to make us fall in love with Julia all over again before the OSS news was released. Paul Child was a part of a cultural control assault on Europe, supposedly meant to better represent American culture. Much work has been done on the cultural Cold War, the use of artists, writers, intellectuals, magazines, and in the end, television to sway the public. Julia also, incidentally, learned to cook at the Cordon Bleu with GIs. The secondary theme, with a new version of Julia Child, is a character called Julie, was someone deeply attached to 9/11, as she worked in an office helping the families affected by 9/11. Someone completely lost, who found herself, her life, her meaning and salvation through cooking her way through Julia's cookbook. This was someone who was flawed in ways Julia Child was not flawed, as was often demonstrated in the film. Julia saved her through example, her instructions on how to cook, and, well, you guessed it, food. Are we to somehow think that the wounds of 9/11 can be salved by food, Julia child? We certainly were meant to think, and we're always meant to think, that manipulating food in just the right way would save us, make us better people, make us richer, happier. Well, you get the idea. These were covert cultural operations, and I do not believe for 1 minute, personally, that Paul Child did not set his wife up on television and know exactly what he was doing and why, even if Julia did not. This was Paul Child's business. Food critics play a big part in the movie as well, as they do now. They are the same as theater critics, book critics, film critics, more people at a very rarefied level telling us what we should want, like, walk away from, never touch, and so forth. The soul's on an even loftier perch than the artists they criticize. From the rise of Charles II after the Reformation and the debauchery of Henry VIII, we glean the gourmand. From Fanny Craddock, Julia Child, and then a host of celebrity chefs given the same status as the most revered actor, we see the rise of the foodie. The rise of the foodie coincided with many food magazines and the rise of the Food Network. Food programs, indeed. Many magazines, beginning in the 1960s, were bankrolled by the CIA and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The newest chef phenomenon that I became aware of recently is a delightful woman of Iranian descent called Samin Nosrat, who has written a book called Pure Alchemy. It was this title and documentary that reinforced the idea that we have simply externalized our inner alchemy, made the esoteric exoteric, and in so doing removed ourselves even farther from who we are. Now, let's talk about sugar. We don't care what sugar does to our body. Let's be honest. We don't care what it's doing to the islet of Langerhans. We don't care what it's doing to our brains, our tongues. We don't care because we're so addicted to sugar. So I'm not going to go into a big discussion here about the biological effects of sugar. What I will do is tell you a story. Emily's story. The sugar receptors are not the same as the place on your tongue when you can sense a sweet taste. Manufactured white sugar and all the other white sugars, which are now sold in different colors, is a drug, a hard drug. I have said that wheat, dairy, and sugar are the three most addictive food substances out there. We remember when the brother of the Kellogg founder released cornflakes covered in sugar, and we were off to the races for the 20th century with a belly full of cold grain mash. This is a hard drug, completely unnatural, the very nemesis of sea salt, and a crystal that's entirely programmable toward messing with your mind. It is just one of the hardcore ways we've been addicted to our tongues and then various other parts of our body. My friend and colleague, Emily Moyer, of Off Planet Media and, of Emily Moyer, did some serious work on the programmable nature of sugar, and the information she shared with me last year I'll share here. There will be more of that in the book, but I've got to check with Emily first. So because anything we put in our bodies is alien and has a dastardly effect on our true nature, refined sugar itself should not be a surprise as a chief criminal. Do not think this is a function of the 20th century either. The elites were downing sugar by the bagful in the Middle Ages. Wars were fought over it, some of them even hiding behind the less objectionable image of tea. Countries were brought to their knees over it. So much death and blood connected to sugar, and now it seems likely that as a crystal it can be programmed, just as computer crystals can be programmed. I'm not going to spend much time discussing your organs and systems. As I said, we listen to that till it's just buzzing in our ears, and most of what is said is nonsense anyway. What will get your attention is a story like Emily's, so listen up. I'm paraphrasing our discussions from over a year ago here. Try to imagine your life without food. How much time would that free up? In 4 conversations last year, we heard Emily Moyer describe her own situation and the role sugar played in it. She spoke quite courageously about being someone who'd been programmed as a child and how her new view about sugar was a direct result of the breakdown of her programming. I could present here the science of the parts of the brain and the rest of the body that's affected by sugar, and have done in the book a bit, but we are all, I think, a bit weary of hearing how bad things affect our body. I think we tune it out. Very few people in reality give a damn what sugar does to their hypothalamus gland, and will change absolutely nothing on that basis. But waking up in the middle of the night with gummy bears stuck to your hair, it's almost like we can all relate to being that addicted to something. A personal story like Emily's reaches us. It reaches us in a way that we understand what the purpose of food programming is. Based on what Emily reported, it would have been about 5 years before now. She was in a very bad place emotionally because of her programming and it breaking down, and she did not want to get to grips with that. And she was in a very bad place physically for the first time in her life. It's important to know that Emily's a true athlete. She was a competitive gymnast, and she has been in top shape as an adult. But now she said she was sick all the time. She heard a woman speaking on Mel Fabregas, who became a good friend, about Candida. Candida is a disease that feeds on sugar. This woman had suffered from MS, multiple sclerosis, but became convinced that the symptoms were caused by sugar. She healed herself, this woman, on Mel's show, by developing a diet that would clear the body of almost all diseases, including autoimmune disease. By the time the interview was over, Emily was convinced that this is what she was dealing with. The woman's office was in LA, so when Emily was ready, she made an appointment. She knew this would require a very strict diet, and it did, and she went on that diet for 90 days. She still adheres to this diet for the most part today. No soy, no gluten, no dairy, no sugar, nothing artificial, and some other small requirements. At that point, Emily says she was really willing to try anything to feel better. Her body started to come back to what she knew it had always been and what it could be. One of the things Emily did not expect was that as a result, her programming really started to break down. She was regaining her health, and things should have been really good, but she was also starting to have memories of things that had either been blocked out or very fuzzy. The healthier her body became, the faster these memories were coming. She was having such a hard time dealing with it, as we all do under these circumstances, and so engaged in other kinds of destructive behavior. This stuff hurts, gang. Emily shared that more than any other substance in her younger life, the most powerful had been sugar. She'd been a sugar addict as a teenager. As a child athlete, she'd not been allowed to have sugar at all. So she said when she turned 16, she felt that that was a license to eat candy. She became so obsessed with sugar that she would wake up in the middle of the night and make her way to 7-Eleven, buy candy, come home, eat it in bed. She said she would actually wake up with gummy bears in her hair. It was crazy. Emily has spoken to many other people with similar backgrounds in MKUltra projects and other mind control programs. They report massive issues with sugar. At some point, Emily started to wonder if it was possible that she was being sent on missions during the night and then would eat candy thinking she was waking up in the middle of the night, when in fact she may have been using the sugar to come back to consciousness. That perhaps there were things she was sent to do and then coming back to consciousness with the candy. Emily no longer eats sugar. There was a time when she was sure she would never be able to live without it. When she found the ability to be able to talk about her experiences and what had gone on in her life, then the ability to start making changes also came. The food we eat keeps us so fuzzy, and in many cases is used to control us. Clearing trauma may well require unplugging from this food. Right now, there's an avalanche of information about programmable matter and about how information can be stored in the body, in DNA. Emily had a truly important story to relate about sugar, and vaping too. She said the first person she knew who was truly addicted to vaping, meaning it was like a pacifier to this friend, became a different person after taking up the practice. They stopped being friends, in fact. She started to do research on mind control and e-cigarettes, that is to say, mind control vaping machines, and found another quote from Nikola Tesla. Remember, Tesla also had something to say about food in general. To paraphrase, Tesla said that one day people would smoke little machines, think they were a good thing, and they would be under total mind control. It's a crystalline liquid, it's sweet, and most of these machines were charged with a new USB port in a computer. Running undetected in the background of your vaping can be the transfer of information stored in a crystalline form. They inhale their programming, as Emily said in a later show, and potentially exhale it toward other people. Sugar's crystalline, it's cubic, and a whole world of information can be stored on a crystal cube. She recounted an episode of a show called Fringe, where a kid was storing historical data on little glass cubes that almost looked like sugar cubes. What about the sugar in cereals on the ads on boxes? What about sugar cereal ads that come with cartoons on TV? Emily remembered that when programming started to break down, she would actually hear a flush of cartoon music with it. It seemed like little bits of information attached to them. She would hear whistling and singing and see streams of nonsense words stream past her. The images seemed demonic, and the speed of this coming out of her was like when you clean up your computer and you see the words and codes streaming past you as the computer searches for things. There is sugar in everything. We have a parasitic consciousness in our internal dimensional lives. It was written about in a book called Mind Parasites by Colin Wilson. Emily pointed out that sugar feeds on yeast and not the other way around. While it's difficult to know how this fits, as of yet, I have become aware that one of the first culturally manipulative journals published in the U.S. was funded by the man who owned the Fleischmann's yeast empire. It strikes me that this could not help but be meaningful and significant in some way vis-a-vis programming. And remember, in my view, sugar is sugar is sugar. I think white processed sugar is a better conveyor of programming, but it's all sugar. My body doesn't do any better on fruit than it does on table sugar. In fact, in 2004, I reported my family doctor to say that I felt I had a metabolic disease. In fact, the worst culprit was rice, which, like everything else, becomes a sugar in your body. I would literally be unable to keep myself from falling asleep after I ate it. Rejecting processed sugars like corn syrup will not fix the issue. The new artificial sweeteners are no good either, as they're crystalline, and anything crystalline is programmable. But one of the most important points that Emily brought forward right away was that the apple story in the Bible could be literal, quite literal. If it was fruit that human beings first imbibed in, then there may have been no turning back, right from the get-go. And remember that the logo for Apple computers is an apple with a bite taken out of it. Computers, programs, apples, sugar. Think about it. They're always shoving it in our faces. I contend that we were invaded by the Drakh, and that the so-called serpent could have nothing more than a Drakh commencing an enslavement protocol. And of course, once we were out of Eden, we became the tillers of the soil and growers of more substances we had no business ingesting. Without this wretched beast to which we are yoked, called food, maybe it really should be called fooled. I've left out any treatment of the fast food industry quite on purpose. Much has been done on that specifically, and it is based on the premise that it is the wrong food, when my premise is food is wrong. What would fall without the food industry? Perhaps every bad intention in the world. If we knew and returned to our true base of sustenance, what would we still need outside ourselves, and what would disappear? Trash, transport, the medical industry, armies, supermarkets, restaurants, abattoirs, bloody oceans, the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry to a large extent. The list of knock-on effects is endless. Trying to get to grips with this thesis and what food really is has certainly shown me just how addicted I am to lots of things. It's opened my eyes and given me a real X marks the spot to head toward. I hope it will do the same for you. And I thank you, my friends, for listening to the audio version of the lecture, Taste Buds, the Great Food Con. This is Kara St. Louis.